Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green, and joining me today is Johan Smarius. Did I pronounce that right?
Yep, that's right. It's a difficult
Excellent.
name. It's a Dutch name, but you pronounced it right.
Fantastic. And today we are going to talk about Visual Studio for Visual Studio Code users. Now, what we've done in the past on this show is we've done several episodes that showcased Visual Studio Code because we see that a lot of Visual Studio users also use code. And today we're going to take it from the opposite direction. We think that a lot of Visual Studio Code users are either using Visual Studio or should start using it in addition, because never hurts to have more tools in your toolbox. So, Johan, today you're going to give us an overview or an introduction to Visual Studio for Visual Studio Code users who are, of course, great .NET developers, but are looking for a way to add to their developer tool set. Before we do that, I want you to introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. I am Johan. I live in the Netherlands, and I have been a .NET developer since, well, the first version of .NET came out in 2001. I started with the first beta versions, and I've done some mostly development on all kinds of stuff, Windows applications, web applications, and throughout my career, I started using Visual Studio, and even when it wasn't even called Visual Studio, when it's still Visual C++, and have been using it ever since. And it's a great product. I also like Visual Studio Code, and I use them both on my normal day-to-day job.
Okay, and your normal day-to-day job is what?
Well, I am a .NET consultant for a local company, Berkeley, and that specializes in the Microsoft stack and the Azure stack. And we normally work for customers all over the Netherlands.
Okay, so let's say in one sentence, explain to me as a Visual Studio Code user why I should start using Visual Studio.
Well, Visual Studio Code is a great product. And through the plugins, you can do a lot of it with it. But if you don't want to discover which plugins you need, or if you want to get an indication of what you could do if you have a lot of plugins, then Visual Studio itself is a great product because you don't have to try and find all kinds of plugins to support your development journey. No, you simply boot up Visual Studio and all the tools will be there for you. Even if you don't want to stick in Visual Studio, it might be a good experience for you if you see all the things that Visual Studio has to offer, that you might think, well, okay, I could try to find a plugin in Visual Studio Code that does almost the same, because this was really helping me in my workflow simply to stay in the context of my development environment so that I don't have to switch to other browser windows, other applications, and can simply stay in the zone and do the thing that I love, simply developing code.
Perfect. All right. So let's see this.
How do you get started with Visual Studio? Well, of course, you do need to install it. There's one downside that I have to mention at the beginning. Visual Studio is a Windows-only product. So if you are using Visual Studio Code and you're running it on a Mac or on Linux, and then your best option is probably to stay on Visual Studio Code. If you are running on Windows, well, you simply go to visualstudio.microsoft.com, and from there you can start downloading it. Of course, you could hit this run button or this download button. It will be fine. But if you go to the downloads, there's a distinction between installing Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio, because Visual Studio Code simply comes in one version. Visual Studio comes in 3 different versions. If you are simply an individual developer or working on a very less than 5 developers, you can use the free community edition. If you work in a larger team or you do need a bit more tooling, you could start using the professional version. And even if you are working on an even larger team and you need some specific tooling around, for instance, architecture or testing, you could use the Enterprise Edition. So it really depends on your use case, which version you want to download. But for this talk, I'm simply going for the Community Edition because that's free and you don't need to pay for a license. You can simply go for the free download and work from that point onwards. What will happen if I click the free download? You will get an installer. And I already have a number of Visual Studio instances running on this machine. So what will happen is you will see this installer once you start running that setup.exe. And you won't see all the 3 versions that I have on this machine, but it does show you that you can actually use or install the different versions if you want to next to each other. The first thing that you're going to see, and I'm going to hit the modify button because then you get the same experience as you have normally when you install it, is you have to select a certain workload. And this is quite different from working from Visual Studio Code. There you don't have to specify a workload, but here I have to select what I want to start working on. If I want to do some web development, I can tick this one. If I also want to do some Azure, it's good to tick this one. If you're going to use Angular or React, Node.js will be a very good workload to add. If you're doing Maui, I love Maui, simply add that one. WinUI you could do, even if you want to do some Office plugins, you could add the workload for that. And if you start switching from Visual Studio Code to Visual Studio, it might be very tempting to simply tick them all. But yes, it will work, but there are 2 downsides to it. It will increase the download enormously, but it will also add a number of functionality to your Visual Studio environment that you don't need. And that extra functionality will only clutter the experience that you need. So my advice would be start out with a workload that you really need. And the fortunate thing is, if you come to the conclusion, well, I, for instance, start out with ASP.NET and I want to add Maui development to my Visual Studio, simply run the installer again, tick the Maui, install the additional packages, and you're good to go.
Yep. And the installer gets installed on your desktop, so you don't need to go back to that download screen to
Sure.
get it.
If you simply run it here, you can see the installer. It's simply on your desktop. You could even use it, for instance, to upgrade to new versions. Visual Studio now comes in a monthly release cadence as well. So if you want to update it, you can also update it from the Visual Studio installer. If you are using the installer, you will see the installation details of the things that will get installed on the right-hand side. Sometimes it might be that you are interested in some additional components. One of the things where I, for instance, always use Visual Studio for, I'm a developer and I love building greenfield stuff. But as a developer, you are always also working on some legacy stuff. And it might be that I need to work on a .NET Framework application and have to maintain it. Well, Visual Studio Code is not that good at it. So I can pick the framework version that I need and simply add that to my environment in the individual components part. One thing that's a nice thing to know, that if you are a non-native English speaker, you can install Visual Studio in your own native language, at least if that falls in this range. And it will definitely help you. I always run it in English because I'm so used to being in an English environment. And if you look closely, there's no Dutch. And even if there was Dutch, I wouldn't install it. But if it can help you get to know the environment. So you will see that a lot of videos that you see online are always in English. But if you want to, you can always add your own language, your own native language to that. And then there's the installation location. That's not that interesting. What you normally will see is where now my close button is you will see the install button. And if you hit the install button, all the workloads that you have selected and all the individual components that you have selected will get installed on your local machine. Okay, we're not going to do that because then we would have to wait for perhaps 15 minutes to half an hour before Visual Studio is installed.
Yeah, but we'd cut it out in the final version, so the viewers wouldn't have to see it, but you and I would have to sit here for 15 minutes twiddling our thumbs.
Yeah, that's not that nice, and it's always good to simply install it, grab some coffee, grab some tea, and come back to it when it's ready. And it's, I must say, really, it has improved a lot over the years. Years ago, it was quite slow, and it could take close to an hour to get Visual Studio installed if you added a lot of workloads. Nowadays, 15 minutes, and I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to close down this box because what will happen if I have installed it on my machine? I simply will launch it, and don't be alarmed. Just for this video, I made the fonts a bit larger so that it's easily seeable. Normally, it really looks nice, but if you blow up the fonts, things will look a bit more shady. Okay, what will you see when you open it up? You will see your recent. Well, if it's the first time that you are going to run Visual Studio, this list will simply be empty. What can you do? You can clone a repository. Nice. If I have a GitHub repo I wanted to start working on, or an Azure DevOps, simply if I have the URL, I can simply use it, clone it, and work on it. I could open up a project or solution if I know that's where it is on my disk. When I can't find it in my recent list, or I don't want it to be found in my recent list, I can simply open it up. I could open up a local folder just like you do in Visual Studio Code, or I can create a new project. Well, that's not entirely true. There's also a link here. If I really want to start just Visual Studio without any code, I could open it up for that as well. And sometimes I use that simply to change the environment settings of it, fonts and things like that. But most of the time, you simply make a choice of one of these. For this demo, we're simply going to create a new project. And what you will see is my recent project templates. And on the first start, this will be empty as well. And you will see a large number of project templates available for you to choose from.
And that's going to depend on the workloads you created. So if you
Definitely. So
didn't see a project type you thought you were going to get, it could be because you didn't actually install that workload.
definitely. So if you see, well, okay, one's missing, simply go back to your installer and double check, have I activated the workload? Okay, I'm a big fan of Blazor, and we're not going to do a deep dive on Blazor or anything like it. I was simply going to use it for the demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to hit next, because I do want to point out a major difference between Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio. In Visual Studio Code, you simply create a new folder, you can create a new project if you're doing .NET, and that's fine. Visual Studio really revolves around the indication of a solution. And you could see a solution as nothing more than a container of projects. So if you look at this dialog, I have a project name, and I can change the project name if I want to. And I have the solution name. Well, and if you look at what the solution name will do, it not only will dictate how the solution will be named, because the solution is simply a file on your file system, but it will also dictate where it will be put on your hard drive. So always make a good decision on what you want to do. A lot of times, there will be one project in one solution, so there's not a problem if they are simply linked. If you want to put multiple projects in the same solution, then do choose a good solution name so that you know that that solution contains a number of projects and not just the first project that you want to add to the solution. Okay, when you hit next, you get the template specific things, and we're simply going to hit create because that's not important. Then we have to wait a bit. It's creating the project. Okay, and what you now will see, Visual Studio has started. We'll do a deep dive in it in a moment. But before we do that, I want to show you something different. Because it's a common misconception that you can only use Visual Studio for .NET related projects. Well, not entirely true. If I go and I add a new project to my solution, you can see my project templates, and you can already see that I have the Angular template that I used that recently. If I simply hit next, I'll simply name it Angular project because it doesn't really matter. I hit create, and on the other screen, but you don't see it, you saw there was a command running. And now you can see that you have the Angular project and the Blazor project within the same solution. So I know that a lot of Visual Studio Code users like to use, if they're using Angular or React, they like to use Visual Studio Code on it. But if you have a .NET component in it, you don't have to. You can use Visual Studio for the JavaScript and TypeScript projects as well. Okay. I don't want to add a lot of code in this empty project because I did prep something beforehand, because I created the same project or solution with the projects that I've shown you, but I've added something more to it. I've added some testing to it. I've added a console application, but that's not going to do anything specific. But just to show you that a solution can contain multiple projects. Okay. One thing that's quite different, if you first boot up Visual Studio and you are accustomed to Visual Studio Code, well, let's compare the two. Here's my Explorer. Great. But here's my Solution Explorer. I know that a lot of developers really like their Explorer to be on the left-hand side. Not a problem at all. You can simply drag and drop almost every window within Visual Studio and put it on a spot where you want it. You could even drag it outside the window of Visual Studio and place it, for instance, on a different monitor.
So the weird thing about that is that I use Visual Studio primarily, and I will often use code. But right now, that looks weird to me to have the Solution Explorer on the left.
True, same for me. I am so used to having it on the right-hand side, but I know that there's a major discussion on social media about having the Solution Explorer placed on the left-hand side, and that should be the default, because people using Visual Studio Code, they do expect it and are quite accustomed to it. But if you've used Visual Studio for 25 years like I have, I'm so accustomed that that thing is on the right-hand side, I don't even mind anymore. I simply start looking at, even in Visual Studio Code, on the right-hand side, where's my Explorer?
Yeah, you get used to it pretty quickly.
Definitely. But what if you really like this style and you really want it to be sticky? Well, one of the tips that I give you, if you go to the window menu, you can say Save Window Layout. And suppose that I say, well, this is the layout for VS Code. Great. I just shown you that you can drag and drop the Solution Explorer like you can any other window. So what happens if I, by accident, pick up the Solution Explorer and put it somewhere in my workspace? Well, the window layout will help you, because if I simply say, well, I want to apply the window layout, it will push it back to the place where I, as a developer, really love it to be.
And then you create one where it's on the left and create one where it's on the right.
Definitely. You can even use a multiple for different things. You can see I do some explaining on Visual Studio or .NET related stuff as well. I've got my window layout, for instance, for classroom settings. I use a different code layout. So you can specify a lot if you want to. Um, just, well, as long as you're happy with it and you know which window layout that you have saved and what it's all about, you can simply play around with them. And if you don't need them anymore, simply go to Manage Windows Layout and you can throw them away if you want to. Okay, let's run through what we can all do in Visual Studio. Well, of course, it's a Windows application, so we've got the menu. And let's simply go it one by one. What do you expect in a file menu? Well, of course, things like saving files, opening files. Well, the same is, of course, true for Visual Studio. But since Visual Studio works with solutions and projects, you can find information about the files or the projects and the solutions here as well. One of the cool things that you can find here, and it's also available in Visual Studio Code, but not every user of Visual Studio Code knows this, is the live share session. It really helps you if you want to peer program with a developer. It works a lot better than sharing a Teams meeting and taking control of another person's screen. If you really want to work together on the same code base, say, give this a try because this really, really is a very nice feature. And as I mentioned, not just in Visual Studio, but you can use it in Visual Studio Code as well. Okay, this is not that specific. If I go to the edit menu, well, what do you expect? Well, of course, things like copy pasting. Okay, great. A thing that was added a few years ago, and that's great, quite nice, but I should put it on a C# file. That's my Paste special. As a developer nowadays, you probably work a lot with JSON or even XML. And sometimes you do need to come up with a class structure for a specific JSON structure. And of course, you can do that by hand. You can also do it in Visual Studio and simply say, well, paste JSON as classes, and you will get the class, the C# layout for that automatically. Saves you a lot of time.
Yes, it does.
Another thing, a cool thing, the clipboard history. I haven't put much on it at the moment, fortunately, but I can see my clipboard history. It can help you if you have copied multiple things, especially if you are working throughout the day. You can see the things that you copied to your clipboard. Other cool things. If you go to the advanced, well, of course, you've got things like form a document. Suppose that you copy in some code and it doesn't conform to the layout that you really want. Yes, you can format it by hand. You can also use form a document and it will do it for you. You can put things to uppercase, lowercase, move things around. Well, not that special. All these things you can also do in Visual Studio Code. But it's good that you get an understanding of what you can do because, let's be honest, working with code in your editor is probably the primary thing that you do during your workday. One of the cool things in Visual Studio, at least I use it a lot on larger code bases, is bookmarks. Sometimes you have a very nice piece of code that you really want to look into and you don't want to lose. Well, you can simply place a bookmark on it and you can navigate through the bookmarks throughout your solution one by one. That makes it a lot easier to work and to start getting to know a larger code base. Of course, there's things like IntelliSense and code completion. There are some refactorings that you can do to help you keep a clean code, move to the next, move to the previous. But one thing that I want to show you, and that's quite powerful, that's on the top of this, the go-to. Because finding a piece of code in your solution can sometimes be quite daunting. Well, I really love this one, go to all. Suppose this is the default Blazor and the default Blazor template uses something around weather. where does weather come from in my solution? Of course, I could simply say find in all files. Yes, I can, but this makes it a lot easier because I can filter here. Where do I want it? Do I want it in files? Do I want it in types, in members, or in text, or simply everywhere? This makes it a lot easier to find a certain term if I am working on a solution and I know, well, okay, I know it was called like this. I simply use the code search everything, and it will pop up what I need. Okay. We already talked a bit. Visual Studio can do a lot for you. But that means that there will be a lot of windows that you need to see, or you can see if you want to. Well, in the View menu, you can control a lot of those windows. For instance, the Solution Explorer. It will happen to you definitely that you, by accident, close the Solution Explorer. Well, simply go to the View menu, click it, and you have it again. Git, I'll come to it. If you are working with servers, there's a Server Explorer so that you can easily walk through your servers. You can work with SQL Server. I added a test project, and there's a specific Test Explorer. And it comes out on the other machine. But as you can see, it simply lists all my unit tests that I have, and I didn't pretend to have a good code coverage in this one, but I can simply say, well, you know what? I'm going to run all my tests and make sure that they're green. And like I normally do, I always try to simply dock it so that I always have it on my left-hand side so that I know that where my test explorer is. Okay. What's more? Of course, my output. You can see it by default, but sometimes I'm interested in my error list. Well, fortunately, I've got 0 errors and 0 warnings. Great. That's what I will strive for. But it's good if you lose it, there are your errors. Of course, I can use the toolbox. And now the toolbox is empty. But what you can do with the toolbox as well, and that's sometimes a thing that I use a lot if I am working on demos, I can, for instance, drag and drop some code snippets to it. What this will also mean that if I am using on a UX framework, like for instance WinForms, .pf, certain controls will appear here automatically. So the toolbox is a quite nice thing to have. And let's see, of course, you don't need to go to a separate terminal if you don't want to. We have the PowerShell, developer PowerShell. And what do we have more? We have here some even more toolbars. One of the things that I do want to show you is the properties window. And why that can be sometimes quite good to observe, because every file will have properties like a build action and if it should be copied to the output directory, or if custom tools should be run. If you are working on, for instance, a WinForms application and you click on the control, you will see the properties of the control. You will see in the properties window. So the properties window is a good one to observe. Well, Git, I'll come to that. Project, you can do a lot on the project because, of course, Visual Studio is about solutions and projects. But to be quite honest, all the things that you see here, you also find if you right-click on the project. And to be honest, most of the time when I'm working on a project, I use the context menu in the Solution Explorer to add things to the project, to manage packages. But no, there's a different menu for it. You can build, and this is a bit different than Visual Studio Code. And I know that a lot of Visual Studio Code users simply hit the run button and think, well, okay, if it builds, then it can run. And if it doesn't build, I will get an error. Well, of course, you can build it in a separate step. You can do that in Visual Studio Code as well. but it's a bit different if you are working in Visual Studio. Visual Studio works with a solution, and that solution contains projects, and there will be dependencies between those projects. So if I want to build the solution, and if I use this one, there will be a dependency check if which projects need to be rebuilt to simply have a good build of the entire solution. So it will save you development time, building time if you simply hit build solution. If you say, well, okay, there's so much change in my solution and I want to rebuild it, I don't care about which projects have been built and probably are still up to date, you can simply run the rebuild. One of the things that I really would advise you, and of course we don't use that often, fortunately, anymore, because most of the time we use Git. But sometimes you do need to zip up your code and send it to a colleague or to a customer or whatever. Always run the clean solution then, because then all the binaries will be removed from the solution, from the output folder, and it will save you a lot of disk space, and your zip will be a lot smaller. Debug I will come to. Test we've already seen. One of the cool things I like about Visual Studio, and don't forget I am running the community edition here, I can still run a code analysis on it. So Visual Studio will check my code for known problems, and I could even run code metrics on it. And we're not going to do a deep dive on code metrics. There is already some content on it, and but it's very good to find out what it's all about, because code metrics can help you with keeping out of trouble. The tools menu, well, of course, there's a lot you can do, but some specifics, Create GUID, I use a lot. Theming, you can determine what you want. I run on the light theme at the moment. And yes, I know there are developers who think, well, if you're running on a light theme, you're not a real developer. But for giving demos, a light theme is great. One of the things, NuGet Package Manager, especially if you have to set up private NuGet feeds, that's your place to go. And of course, there's the options. And as you can see, there are a lot of options.
A ton of options.
And where can you find the correct one? Well, even after 25 years, I don't know where to find the correct option. Fortunately, I don't have to, because I can simply add, well, okay, I want fonts and colors, and I have the setting that is specific for font and colors. So if you have an indication of what the option is named, you can simply type it in, and Visual Studio will do the filtering for you. And now you can even see that my text editor is really at a very large size, and my environment is that as well. Let's see where my environment is. You will see at 16. So that's why Visual Studio in this video looks a bit bloated compared to the normal one. Okay, extensions will come to Windows. Okay, there are only a few things that I want to show you, because Windows management is probably a thing that you are quite familiar with. But I really like this one, especially if you're working on a larger file. I can split it up, and the same file is shown in two different panes. And I can work on the top, I can work on the bottom. That will help me a lot in larger files. And of course, what I can simply do is create document groups. Okay. And yeah, let's simply cover it, because I think it's good. If you work with a large number of files, sometimes it's nice simply to be able to pin certain files so that they will always keep on the left-hand side. And I don't want that one anymore, so I'll simply drag and drop it. Okay. A lot of options. And how can you remember all those options? Well, fortunately, you don't have to. If you hit the search, here you see the code search that I just showed you, but there's also a feature search. And suppose that I want to start debugging this. I'll simply search for the debug feature, and it will show me everything that has to do with debugging. Okay,
Will
let's
that actually do that or just take you to the menu?
It will actually, if I simply hit it, it will actually execute the action.
Okay. So it shows you the keyboard shortcut F5. It shows you the menu, debug, start debugging, and then you can actually do it.
Definitely. And one of the advices that I would give you if you start working with Visual Studio, yes, there are a lot of keyboard shortcuts attached to a lot of actions. But don't worry too much about them in getting to know them. Learn them along the way. If you are looking for a certain feature and you are debugging enough, then after a few days, you will know that start debugging is F5. If you think, well, okay, I can only use debugging if I know that it's F5, it will simply slow you down, and not only slow you down, but it probably will also make you frustrated because then the environment will become more complex than needed.
I don't use a lot of keyboard shortcuts. I use 90% of what I do is through the menus.
And that's fine.
That's just how I do it.
And yes, of course, for debugging, I use a lot of keyboard shortcuts because that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. But for a lot of other things, I go through the menus as well because I don't want to remember every keyboard shortcut. And even if you want to use keyboard shortcuts, you can always reassign the keyboard shortcuts if you want to. Okay, back to debugging. There's a difference between start debugging, start without debugging. Debugging, start debugging, I simply boot up the debugger and I can put breakpoints in my screen. Works great. Suppose that I say, well, okay, I want to run my application, but I don't think that I will need to debug. I can make it a bit quicker and simply start without debugging. But what will happen if I run into a problem and I think, well, okay, I really would love to have the debugger now. Of course, I can simply stop the application, start debugging, and hope that I can reach the same situation again. Or, and that makes it a lot easier, I can simply attach it to the process. And then Visual Studio will attach to the running process of my application, and the debug functionality will become available. So that's a definite thing that I would recommend to you if you are keen on starting without debugging. You can always attach it later on if you really want to. Well, let's simply start debugging. So I double click on it and I will drag the other screen there, and you will see the default Blazor application shown. Okay, great. Which has a home, which has a counter button, and if I click it, it will increase the count. And if I go to weather, it will simply show some weather forecasts. Okay, but suppose that I have my doubts about what is displayed in this grid. Okay, let's first start out with the code in the front end. Well, okay, this is the place where my forecasts actually are calculated. And I really would love to know what forecasts is all about before it's displayed. And yes, I could simply put on the console write line and put forecasts and hope it will show up in my output window. But that would be a waste because in Visual Studio, you do have a very good debugger. And it's always nice and good to start to know it. And it's not that difficult because placing a breakpoint can be as easy as moving to the left gutter and simply clicking there with my left mouse. Or if I don't want that or don't know it, I can simply right click and put breakpoint and insert a breakpoint. It doesn't matter, but now I do have a breakpoint. And what I want to do, I'll simply want to refresh this page. Because I do want to explain certain concepts for debugging. because that's good to know. Suppose that I only am interested in the result that get forecasts returns. Well, then there's a button here that says, well, step over. And what it will do, it will simply execute the code and make sure that the forecasts get assigned. And you will see that it's quite small. I can hover over it. I can even use the autos window for it. I could even use the locals window for it. So it's easy to observe what happens in forecasts. But what will happen if I see here and I think, well, okay, I'm not quite sure what happens within the code of get forecasts. Okay. I could simply run this function again. One of the cool things I like about Visual Studio is that I can simply set a new statement. I can revert back to the code that was already executed and say, well, okay, now I want to not step over, but I want to step into. And what will happen? Now my code gets displayed and I can step over all the different steps. And suppose that I see, okay, summaries is what I did expect to be bad, but okay, it's fine. Of course, I could hit the continue button. And then the application will run or run at least until the next breakpoint, if there's even one. But what if I still want to know what happens in the calling code? Of course, I could simply say, go back to my razor and place a breakpoint here. I don't have to. What I can simply do is simply say here, step out, and it will return to the original call. And I can simply double check, okay, that's what it is. This really is a feature that I would encourage you to start learning. The debugger is quite powerful in Visual Studio, and it can really, really help you diagnose bugs in your code. And I don't like going through all kinds of console write lines, debug statements. My debugger is my friend. One of the things that Visual Studio Code users love is, of course, the plugins. And if you look at what kind of plugins are used, a lot of them revolve around being able to change the way the environment looks. The same possibility you do have in Visual Studio, but those are not called extensions, they're called extensions. So if I go to Manage Extensions, I can, for instance, start looking for different extensions, and Microsoft did release, for the 25th anniversary of Visual Studio, a special theme pack, and I could install it. One thing to remember, if you install an extension, most of the time, it will be installed when you close down Visual Studio, then it will get installed, and then you can start up Visual Studio again. Another extension that I really would love you to see is an extension made by Matt Christensen. He is involved with the Visual Studio team, and he makes some great extensions. This will add the possibility to open up Visual Studio Code from within your Solution Explorer.
Yeah,
So
we
that's
just
great.
did it. We just did an episode with him where he showed a bunch of extensions that make you happier.
Yeah, I really, really love his extensions. Okay. Working with Git. I know a lot of Visual Studio Code users simply use the command line. And yes, you can do that, but it's a bit of waste, because if you look in Visual Studio, and that's why I switched back to the original generated code, it's easy enough. I can simply create a Git repo from newly created code. I can simply say, I want to push it on GitHub. Here's my license template. I want to add a README. This is where I want to put it. What's my visibility? I do get the default Visual Studio Git ignore template. And all I have to do is simply create and push. And then it will be pushed to GitHub. Okay. Will save you a lot of time, because I don't know how about you, but I always tend to forget the Git command line options, and I don't have to, because Visual Studio does remember them for me. Okay. we can't have any good code anymore if we don't have anything AI related, of course. And I know that a lot of people do like Visual Studio Code because there's such a good integration with GitHub Copilot. Well, Visual Studio Code is not the only one. Let's simply do this one and say ask Copilot and say introduce variable and change it to hello Visual Studio. Well, let's simply run it, see how fast it is. Oh, perfect. And I can accept it and it will do it for me. And of course, there's always also the chat window. And you can run it like you do in Visual Studio Code. You can simply ask things. I haven't done Angular projects in ages, so I had to ask it, well, okay, how do I work with, for instance, Angular? But that's not all. We all like the agent mode in Visual Studio Code, right?
Agent modes in Visual Studio.
And it's also in Visual Studio. So I really had no idea. I wanted to have the push button like it was in the Blazor application. And all I did was simply ask it, well, generate me a page that does that. Okay, I did have to correct it a bit, but then again, it was quite nice. And even if you run it, oh, that's what I forgot to show you. Great. That's good. One thing as a dessert, you can configure multiple startup projects within Visual Studio. And that's a good thing to do because you can't always do that very nicely in Visual Studio Code, but it's so easy in Visual Studio if you know where to look that you can simply say, I want to run multiple projects at the same time. So I now added a profile to it. And what will happen? Just wait a bit because it does have to build. It will open up. Almost there. Yes. There's my Angular app. And just wait a bit. And there's my Blazor app. And that's a very cool feature. And that's what I really miss when I'm working in Visual Studio Code. This is what I really, really love. Okay. This is all the demo that I want to give you. And I really hope that I have been able to give you the impression that Visual Studio may look complicated, but if you know the correct things, that you know where to search, that it can be less complicated than you anticipate. And it really is a great product to work with. It offers a lot of functionality out of the box. Functionality where you may not be aware of if you are using Visual Studio Code, that you think, well, okay, this is a great thing to have if I am working in my software development project. So my advice would be, like we mentioned in the introduction, simply give it a try. Do add it to your toolbox. It doesn't mean that you only have to use Visual Studio Code. I don't. I use Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio on some projects even next to each other. But do know that it's a tool in your toolbox and it really can help you, especially if you have to work on complex projects.
Yeah. The debugging, profiling tools, some of the more advanced tools are extremely powerful. And like you said, you absolutely can use them both. You can use one for some things that you like, and you like to do other things. Maybe you write your code in Visual Studio Code and debug in Visual Studio because you think it's better that way. Or maybe you do it the other way around. You're writing the exact same code. So in terms of building and running, it doesn't matter. So use them both. Absolutely. All right. Great. Thanks so much for coming on and showing us this, Johan. It's a great introduction to Visual Studio for Visual Studio Code users. Is obviously a lot more, a lot of that stuff that we discuss in this show. So
Definitely. There are some awesome videos available. And even if you run into trouble, There's a Q&A on Microsoft Learn. You can reach out on the community. There are so many wonderful people that are willing to help you should you run into problems with Visual Studio. So don't let that prevent you from start using Visual Studio.
Absolutely. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.